Okay. Um, Tonight is part 4 in our continuing series on the 12th chapter of Chulin. We're gonna start toward the bottom of 139b and go on to 140a. And we are gonna start by quoting a bit of the Mishnah from last time. The Mishnah had said that the mitzvah of Shiluach HaKain, of sending away the mother bird from the nest, is only for birds that are not what the Mishnah calls mizuman. They're not prepared. And one of the examples that the Mishnah gave of birds that are prepared, meaning that the mitzvah does not apply to them, are hardasiot, yonot hardasiot, I think it said, right? Which we translated as Herodian doves, or domesticated doves. It seems to be a variety of dove that was domesticated and that was, for whatever reason, associated with Herod. Our Gemara is going to assume that Herod himself is the one who domesticated them. Although that doesn't necessarily tell me everything I want to know. For one thing, there's more than one king called Herod, but even if we assume that we're talking about the original one, we're going to play fast and loose with the historical timeline here, and some strange things are going to happen. I wouldn't assume historicity on anything, but there seems to be a variety of dove which is at least named after Herod, or according to some versions of the Mishnah. There's another problem, which is that there seem to have been two versions of the Mishnah, one in which these doves are called herdasiot, and the other in which they're called hadrasiot, with the letters in the other order. So we're going to deal with that first. So Rabbi Cheses and Rabbi Shimon. We have Rabbi Cheses and Rabbi Shimon, and here we have another the manuscript or memorizing, I don't know which, problem, which is that we apparently don't know who took which position of this dispute. Chad amar hadrasiot. One of them said hadrasiot from consonants hey, dalid, resh, samach. V'chad amar hardasiot, and the other had the resh before the dalid, so that it was hey, resh, dalid, samach. Mandatani hardasiot al shem hordus. The one who said it was hardasiot, that person thought that they were named after Herod. Umandatani hadrasiot al shem mekoman. And the one who had the dalid before the resh was naming them based on their location. I don't know where Hadras is, but apparently it's a place that's associated with these birds. Amar Rav Kahana. So Rav Kahana said, and Rav Kahana is a Babylonian Amora. So he's living in Babylonia. He's living after the time of the Mishnah, which is a solid at least 200, probably more like 250 or 300 years after Herod died, and in a different country. So I think we may need to take with a grain of salt the things that he says about these birds. On the other hand, there's at least one voice in the Gemara that seems to take it with a grain of salt too. So I think we're in good company. In any case, Rav Kahana said, "Lididi chazyan kaiman shitzar dari bifti mila." So the Rav Kahana said, I personally saw these birds, and they were standing in 16 rows, each of which was a meal long. Now a meal is, as far as I know, linguistically, comes from the same Latin word that the English mile comes from. A meal in the Talmud is not exactly the same length as a mile, but it's a distance that's supposed to take about 18 minutes to walk. So it doesn't sound to me like it's that different than our mile. It's close enough for our purposes, since we're measuring the lengths of groups of birds anyway, and I doubt we're measuring them precisely. In any case, that's an awful lot of pigeons. Vahave Kara Kiri Kiri, and they were calling out, my master, my master. Although Kiri Kiri sounds like the sort of thing that birds might just sort of say, Kiri Kiri, right? Like that sounds like a bird call. But we are going to interpret this as if it's human words. Hava who delo hava kari kiri kiri. But there was one dove that refused to call out kiri kiri. Amra lachaverta. So Amra lachaverta. Sorry, one of the other doves said to the one who was being quiet, Suma, Emri kiri kiri, blind one, you need to say kiri kiri. Like that's what we're doing. We're saying kiri kiri. And it seems like Rashi thinks that kiri kiri means like Herod is king. Like that's why we're saying my master, my master. And that's why I think that the timeline's a little fuzzy here, because like I said, Rav Kahana is a long time after the time of the original Herod. Maybe he's imagining them saying this to whoever their current owner is, not to Herod. I'm not sure. In any case, the uncooperative bird responds, Amra Suma Emri Kiribiri. She said, no, you're the blind one. You should be saying, my master, my slave. Which seems to be see, this is why it's difficult to interpret this as talking to somebody other than Herod, because in the Gemara's telling of the story, Herod is a usurper who was a slave in the Hashmonai palace, and used his position as a slave in the palace to usurp the throne, marry the princess, and it's an old story. It's happened many times, and the Gemara thinks that Herod is one of the perpetrators of this particular thing. Quickly skimming the Wikipedia article about Herod this morning, it didn't look to me like that's the normative understanding of what happened. But that's from the inside of the Gemara seems to believe that Herod started out as a slave. And so it sounds like what we're saying is that one of these doves is saying to another one of the doves, stop calling the king master because he's really a slave. They came and slaughtered her. Now, keep in mind that this is a bird kept for meat, right? Like slaughtering an uncooperative farm animal is not quite the same thing as slaughtering an uncooperative human. Although there may well be an undercurrent of feelings here about the way that the Herodian palace treated uncooperative humans. Also, Herod was an extremely bloody monarch. So there may be some political critique here as well. Amar Rav Ashi. Okay, so we're sort of done with Rav Kahana's story about the birds, except that we're not done with it, because Amar Rav Ashi, Amar li Rabbi Chanina Milin. So Rav Ashi says, Rabbi Chanina said to me, and Rav Ashi is even later than Rav Kahana, right? We're now, I think, in the 5th century, or at least in the 4th century. We're way out of Herodian times. Rabbi Chanina said to me, that's just words. It's just a story. But the Gemara is not pleased with that idea. Milin Salkadata, could that possibly just be words? What, rabbis say stuff and it's not true? Ella ema bimilin. It must be you misheard, and it wasn't words, it was with words. Meaning, I know how that magic was done with the talking birds. That must have been done with magic spells. That's what with words means here. Which seems to mean that we had a rabbinic voice that might have been not taking this story seriously, and then the narrator says, nah, that can't possibly be, and rewrites it so that it's a voice taking the story seriously after all. I don't know exactly what to do with that. But we're moving on. The other thing that the Mishnah had told us, or another thing that the Mishnah had told us, was that the mitzvah of Shiluach HaKain applies only to kosher species. So we are going back to that topic. Of tamei patur milishaleach. That's the quote from the Mishnah. A non-kosher bird is exempt from sending, and we're going to talk about a whole bunch of different ways of being non-kosher the rest of the evening. Probably I should have found a way to disambiguate in the English translation, but I didn't. I will do my best to be clear speaking out loud. An oaf tamei is a species of bird that's not kosher, right? Like an owl or an eagle or something like that, right? As opposed to a bird that comes from a kosher species but has not been slaughtered properly, which will also interact with them. That will be a treifa or a nevela. We'll come upon those. But they're not the same thing. Okay. So the Gemara wants to know minahani mili. Where does the Torah tell us that the mitzvah of shiluach only applies to kosher species? Amar Rabbi Yitzchak de Amar Kra ki karei kan tzipor lefanecha. Because Rabbi Yitzchak says it's in those same two psukim that everything else in this entire chapter is based on, which began when a bird's nest happens to be in front of you. And the word for bird there is tzipor, right? There are two words, probably more than that, but there are two main words for bird in the Torah. They are tzipor and oaf. And our Gemara is going to spend the rest of this evening and part of next week trying to demonstrate that the word tzipor means a kosher species of bird specifically, and that if you meant a non-kosher species, you would use a different vocabulary word, either a kanaf or an oaf. We're gonna it's gonna take a while to try to demonstrate that, but that's what we're gonna try to do. So Rabbi Yitzchak is still talking. He says, "Oaf mashmalan ben tahor ben tamei." And oaf would mean either kosher or non-kosher species. Tzipor tahor ashkechan diikri tzipor. We find kosher species described with the word tzipor. Tamei lo ashkechan diikri tzipor. But we don't find non-kosher species described with the word tzipor. Now that sounds like a challenge, and the Gemara is going to take it as such, and now we're going to try to find such a thing. Okay, so now the rest of the text for quite some time is going to be quoting every pasuk the Gemara can think of where it uses the word tzipor, and you might have thought that it included some non-kosher species as well as kosher species. Beginning here, Tashma, Devarim, this is Devarim Dalid Yud Zayin. Tavnit kol tzipor kanaf. Okay, so this is in the 4th chapter of Devarim, and the Torah is telling us at some length about how not to make idols that look like animals. Okay, and there's a sort of a list of animals not to make idols in the shape of. Presumably, it means don't make any idols in the shape of anything. But it does have a long list of things not to make idols out of. And on that, in the course of that list, it lists tavnit kol behema asher ba'aretz, right? The construction, the shape of any domesticated mammal that is in the land. Tavnit kol tzipor kanaf, or the shape of any tzipor kanaf. I'm not going to translate that for the moment, but normally tzipor means bird and kanaf is a wing. Asher ta'uf bashamayim, which flies in the sky. Then it goes on to talk about squirmy things on the ground, fishes that are in the water, and so on. Okay, so don't make an idol in the form of a tzipor kanaf. Presumably, you're not allowed to make an idol in the form of an owl or an eagle or vulture any more than you're allowed to make a idol in the form of a chicken or a dove or a duck, right? Like, presumably this is not limited to the kosher species. So the Gemara says, "My love tzipor ben tahor ben tamei kanaf chagavim." Doesn't it make sense to say that tzipor is talking about birds, whether of kosher species or non-kosher species, and the word kanaf is there to add the locusts, which are they occupy a cultural space somewhere in between insects and birds in these kinds of discussions. Um, the Gemara says, no, tzipor tahor kanaf tamev chagavim. Of course, if you're going to have two words, it's easy enough just to say, well, the other word is the one that's talking about all of the non-kosher species. The tzipor is talking about the kosher species of birds, and everything else that flies, whether it's a locust or a non-kosher bird, is going to be included in the word kanaf. Okay, this is going to get a little bit repetitive as the Gemara itself is actually going to acknowledge. Tashma, hachaya v'chol behema remes v'tzipor kanaf. All right, this is a chapter of Tehillim, which we say in davening. Tehillim 148. Yeah. Oops, I went too far. And oh, it's almost the end. There are only 150 chapters. Not sure I ever processed that before. Okay, verse 10. And here we have the poem is listing all of the things that ought to praise God, right? And they're not all animals. The pasuk chet includes fire and ice and snow and smoke, and a storm, right? And then we've got in verse 9 we've got mountains and valleys and fruit trees and cedars. And then our verse continues the list. The wild mammals and domesticated mammals, remes and squirmy things, vitzipor kanaf. And the same phrase that we had before, which apparently means birds and other winged things. That seems to be the way that we read it last time, so let's go with that. And the Gemara starts with the same response it had last time. My lav tzipor ben tahor ben tameh v'kanaf chagavim. So doesn't that mean that the tzipor is birds, whether they're kosher or not, and winged things? That means locusts. Lo tzipor tahor kanaf tameh v'chagavim. No, we're gonna the same as before. We're gonna say that the tzipor is the kosher birds, and the kanaf, the other winged things, that's everything else, the non-kosher bird species and the locusts. Okay, now we go back in time. There's no attempt at this being in order here. We're in Breshit 7:14 in Parshat Noah, and Noah is loading the animals onto the ark. What was I? And in that list, it says v'chol oaf l'minehu kol tzipor kol kanaf. And every oaf, every bird according to its kind, every bird, every winged thing. And since again, presumably we think that the non-kosher birds were on the ark, same as the kosher birds, so that we need to put them here somewhere. So the Gemara says, "My love kidamakshinan." Isn't it the same as the question we asked last time, which presumably means tzipor is both the kosher and the non-kosher birds, and kanaf is the locust? Lo kidamashninan. Nope, same answer as before. No, in fact, tzipor is just going to be the kosher birds, and everything else will be the winged things. Right. The Gemara itself has become bored with this conversation, and we're using shorthand to indicate that we know perfectly well the questions and answers are the same for every verse here. Okay. I mean, just for two more, and then things will get a little different. Tashma. Ve'ata ben Adam and more l'tzipor kol kanaf. So here we are in Yechezkel, 39:17. And God likes to call Yechezkel ben Adam. He likes to call him son of Adam. And so when it says son of Adam, that means God is, addressing the prophet directly. And here we are in 39:17. And he tells him, and you, Adam, so says God, speak to the bird and to all of the winged things, and to all of the wild animals of the field, gather and come and gather from all around to my sacrifice that I am sacrificing for you. Right? It's like God is having a party, and he is inviting all of the wild animals to this party. Right? This is a strange, extremely strange prophecy. I don't have any understanding of it. I don't know why you would invite animals to an animal sacrifice and then invite them to eat the sacrificial meat. That seems to be what God is telling Yechezkel to say to the animals. I'm sure that this is a metaphor in some way. But one way or the other, we again have the same phrase, the tzipor kol kanaf, right? He's supposed to invite the birds and every winged animal. And so we
Oh,
ask again, yes.
I I can make a suggestion that maybe like animals also eat animals, so it's not like such an offensive. It's not
It
necessarily the most offensive thing. Like people, like you wouldn't, God forbid,
it's
invite people to eat people, but animals eat animals.
but there seem to be a lot of things that are backwards about this image. Among them, that God seems to be the one bringing the sacrifice and having a party. Um,
Okay, yeah,
right,
fine,
like
yeah.
something very strange is going on here, which is not a surprise because something very strange happens on every page in Yechezkel.
Right.
It is extremely uh mind-bending book. Um, I'm just saying I don't pretend to know what the metaphor or the message is here, but the reason we're quoting it is because it seems to be trying to list all birds and calling them tzipor and kanaf. And the Gemara says, "My love kida akshinan." Isn't this question here the same as we asked everywhere else? Lo kida shanina. No, the answer is the same as everywhere else. Also, okay. So you might think that the word tzipor includes kosher birds and also non-kosher birds. No, we can say that the non-kosher birds are included in the word kanaf instead, and we can keep the word tzipor to only mean kosher birds. Same as before. Okay, Tashma. So now we're in Daniel. So now our language is switching to Aramaic, but otherwise the uh, idea is very similar. So we're in Daniel 4:9, and oops, wrong page. And Daniel is describing a vision that he saw, and one of the things that he sees is um a tree where uvan pohi yedurun tzipare shmaya, that in the branches of this tree will live the tziporim of the sky, the birds of the sky. Um, and that does seem to include all the birds. And unlike the previous cases that we had, there isn't a second word that means bird or flying thing or whatever here that we can just dump the other species on. So the Gemara has to come up with a different response, and it says Tzipari Shmaya Ikru. When you Daniel means all of the different species of birds, and he uses tzipor for that. He calls them Tzipari Shmaya, the birds of the sky. Tzipor Stama Lo Ikru, but he doesn't just use the plain word tzipor. Right, so the plain Tzadi Pei Reish can still mean only kosher species of birds, even though Daniel does on one occasion use the phrase Sipore Shmaya to mean kosher and non-kosher birds, because he has a modifier. So that means that it's a different term. They could have said that's the Aramaic word, this is the Hebrew word, but I don't think they don't like to do that. Insofar as it's possible to keep this equivalent shoresh have the same meaning in biblical Hebrew and biblical Aramaic, they would prefer to stick that with that. Okay, Tashma. Now here we're going to get to the one that's going to occupy us for the rest of the evening. We are in Devarim 14:11, and give me a second to get there. I should have marked the page. Here we have one of the lists of what kinds of animals are kosher, what kinds of animals are not kosher. right? The preceding two psukim were about there being fins and scales on fish, right? And then it says, Kol tzipor tehora tochelu. Any tzipor that is kosher, you can eat. Now that seems problematic because if you need an adjective to tell me that the tzipor is kosher, then we got a problem, right? So tashma kol tzipor tahora, any kosher tzipor, michlal dika tmea. That implies that you could be a tzipor and be a non-kosher species, right? That seems like a problem. Low. They say no. It implies something else. Michlal dika asura. Right? It doesn't necessarily imply that there are non-kosher species that can be called tzipor. It just means that there's a bird that you're not allowed to eat that could still be called a tzipor, but it might be non-kosher for a reason other than its species. Okay, mahi, what would that be? Well, oops. Um, e trefa behediktiv. So if you're going to tell me that the problem is that the kind of bird it's excluding is a treifa, that's not going to work because I have it explicitly somewhere else. Now, a treifa is a bird which is it might even still be alive, but it is injured in such a way that it is well, let's say gravely injured, and according to the position which I believe we end up following, not likely to survive. Although there's a dispute about whether treifas are actually considered alive or not, whether they're likely to die or not. But there's a list of injuries in earlier in Masechet Chulin, and this is the last chapter in Chulin, so almost everything is earlier. There's a list of injuries which qualify an animal, a bird or a mammal, as a treifa, and an animal that has those injuries is considered a treifa whether or not it's going to die, and an animal that's going to die is not necessarily a treifa if it doesn't have those injuries. Um, Once a treifa dies, even if it dies through kosher slaughter, through shchita, it's still not kosher to eat for whatever reason. Either because it was going to die anyway, so the slaughter isn't what killed it, or just because God said so, whatever. But it's not once an animal has been injured in one of these ways, it has a hole in one of its internal organs, it has a limb which is destroyed in a way that impairs its life, whatever. Once an animal has one of these injuries, it's never going to be a kosher animal. So that might have been a reasonable suggestion for what we were talking about here. It could be an animal which is of a kosher species. It could be a chicken or a duck or a goose or a turkey or whatever, and still be a non-kosher bird, even alive, if it had one of these injuries. But that's not going to work because we have another pasuk in Vayikra, which I included the citation there because the Gemara doesn't actually quote it, but it seemed important for us to go there for a minute. So Vayikra 22:8 says, Nivelahu trefa lo yochal litama ba'ani Hashem. So he will not eat a nivela. Nivela is an animal that died by means other than shchita. Doesn't make any difference what those means were, right? It fell off a cliff. It died of old age. It got shot with an arrow. It got mauled by a lion. It doesn't matter. As long as it died by means other than shchita, we call that a nivela. So a nivela or a trefa, he may not eat. And this passage is actually talking about Kohanim, but we seem to think that this particular pasuk is talking about all Jews. So I don't need the pasuk in Devarim to tell me that some birds might be a treifa and then I won't be permitted to eat them, because I already have a pasuk in Vayikra that tells me that I'm not allowed to eat a treifa of any species, which it seems obvious to the Gemara anyway, would include both birds and mammals. So I don't need this pasuk to tell me about that. So this has to be there has to be something else that it's telling me I'm not allowed to eat when it says that I can only eat a tzipor that's kosher. Okay. Which means basically that there's gonna have to be a bird which is shechted that's still not kosher. It's shechted and it's not injured and it's still not kosher. So now we're going to go off searching for that. Okay. V'i bishchuta de mitzora seifa de kranav. So maybe you'll think that it is the shechted bird of the Mitzora. A Mitzora is a person with a disease or complex of diseases called Sarat. I is often mistranslated leprosy. I am not going to use that translation because it's obviously wrong. The symptoms are obviously not the right symptoms for what we now know as Hansen's disease or leprosy.
Uh,
Yes.
Wait, how is it? I guess I could research this after how it's obvious that it's not leprosy, but I guess leprosy is just a modern disease and that's like a biblical disease, so that's
But
a
the
different thing.
symptoms are just not right. Like the Torah has very precise descriptions of what the sores look like on your skin, and it's just not the right not the right thing.
Okay.
Right? It's not it doesn't describe the symptoms that you get from Hansen's disease. In any case, so I'm not going to call this person a leper. I'm going to call them a mitzora. But the process that this person goes through to re-enter the community after they're healed involves taking two birds, and one of them is killed by shchita, and its blood is collected in a bowl. The other bird is dipped in the blood and then released into the wild. It's a very, very strange procedure. But the bird that's killed is in fact shechted by the normal procedure of shchita, but it is not in fact kosher for eating. So maybe that's the bird we're talking about. But it can't be, because we learned that from the end of that same from the end of the pasuk that we just quoted. Um mm, that's actually not the end of the it's the next pasuk. I'm sorry. The next pasuk after the one we quoted with the tzipor tahora is v'zeh asher lo tochelu mehem. And these are the ones you shouldn't eat from them. The word from them does not seem to really belong here. It should have just said, it would seem. Um, and these are the birds you shouldn't eat. And then there's a list of species that are not kosher. The word from them is taken here, l'rabot shchutat mitzara, to include that, yes, there's also a bird from the kosher birds that you're not allowed to eat. That's the shechted bird from the mitzara procedure. So that we think for the moment can't be it. Then we go back and we say, no, maybe it really is. No, really it is excluding the slaughtered bird from the mitzvah procedure. And it's here twice in the pasuk, once in this pasuk and once in the following pasuk, so that there will be two mitzvahs not to eat it. Right? We have it's implied not to eat it in the one that says eat the kosher birds. So now when you eat something that's not a kosher bird, you're violating the positive mitzvah to eat kosher birds. And it's also included in don't eat the not kosher birds. So now when you eat it, you'll be violating a negative commandment to not eat not kosher birds. So, but the Gemara says, well, once you're willing to pull a trick like that, the lukma betrefa. So then you could say the same thing about the trefa. Maybe the lavor alav base velotase. Maybe I learned not to eat a trefa in Vayikra, and here I learned that I'm supposed to only eat kosher birds, and that gives me both a positive and a negative commandment about not eating the trefa. And maybe I can use it that way also. But the Gemara doesn't like that. No, because you have to have some kind of limitation or at least preference for learning things that are resonant with their context. And our context here is about birds killed for food, or at least birds that are killed using a slaughtering technique. And so we're going to and the bird that we're excluding here is going to be a bird that's basically similar to the kosher birds, except that it happens to have been used in the shechita, in the Mesorah ritual, but it is shechted, so that it's more similar to the context. Tashma. Okay. So now we're going to go deeper into this uh Mitzvah ritual. So we're going back to Vayikra 14:4. Okay, well, here we're at the very beginning of Parshat Mitzorah, and the Torah is telling us how to do the ritual that gets the Mitzorah out of being a Mitzorah. And verse 4 says, "V'tzivah Kohen, the Kohen will command, v'lakachla mitaher shtei tziporim chayot torot, and he will take for the person who is becoming tahor, two birds, two living kosher birds. The birds have to be both chayot and tahorot. Ve'etz erez ushni tolat, and a piece of cedar wood and a red string, and a piece of ve'ezov, and a piece of hyssop. Okay, so now we want to know this phrase, shtei tziporim chayot tehorot, although they only quote the first three words of that. So this is my chayot. What do you mean live? Like, of course they're alive. You could tell they're alive from the fact that we're about to kill them as part of one of them anyway, as part of the ritual, and the other one is going to fly away. Like, it doesn't seem necessary to tell me that the birds are alive. So it can't mean that. So the Gemara says, doesn't that mean lav shechayot beficha? Doesn't it mean they live in your mouth? Michlal deika lav shechayot beficha, and live in your mouth seems to mean they're kosher. Like, this is the kind of thing that's supposed to be spending time in your mouth, not this specific bird because it's alive, and in any case you're about to do something sacrificial with it, but this kind of bird. And that would imply that there are tziporot that are tziporim that are not kosher. Okay. No, we're gonna reject that meaning of chayot. Look, my chayot, what does chayot mean? Shechayin roshei evarin shalahen. It means that not only is the bird alive, which, like I said, you could tell from the fact that we're about to kill it, but all of its body parts are also alive. Right? It has to be intact with living functional wings and legs and beak and I don't know, whatever other body parts there are that are on the outside of a bird. Rocher Evarin usually are protruding body parts. Birds don't have so many of those. They're kind of aerodynamic. But whatever, the body parts it's got need to be alive and functional. So then, fine. So the word chayot isn't going to cause us a problem. That doesn't mean kosher. But the next word in the pasuk was tihorot, and that usually means from a kosher species. Okay, tashma miseifa tihorot. So look, it says tihorot. Michlal d'ikatmeo. That implies that it's possible for a tzipor to be tameh, or that is to say, it's possible for a tzipor to come from a non-kosher species. Lo michlal d'ikatrefot. No, it's just implying that it's possible for there to be a treifa of this species. Except that we know this bird isn't a treifa already because we just said that chayot means it has to be physically intact. So treifot mechayot nafka, that no, I'm sorry, the fact that you said it has to be alive and all of its body parts have to be in good working order, that's what tells me that it's not a treifa. It can't be when you tell me that it has to be tahor, that's what's telling me it's not a treifa. So so that's gonna work out okay for somebody who says that a treifa is alive. But the problem is, and I'll explain what our problem is in a second. Let me get through another line or two. That for somebody who says that treifas aren't alive, what is there to say? And remember, I did mention that there's this dispute about whether a treifa is that's the word I want, is viable or not. V'od bein leman da'amar treifa chaya, bein leman da'amar eina chaya, midatana debe Rabbi Yishmael nafka. So, and it in any case, whether you say that a treifa can live or a treifa can't live, a treifa is alive, isn't alive, it doesn't matter because we know that this particular bird can't be a treifa from something else entirely, from the Bright of the school of Rabbi Yishmael. Okay, so we might have had a problem learning about whether this bird could be a treifa from the word alive or not, depending on how you whether you think a treifa is alive or already sort of dead. But it doesn't matter in the end, because no matter what position you take on that, we can't learn treifa from this pasuk because we have another source that tells us that the birds of a mitzvah can't be a treifa. So we actually are going to get stuck not knowing. We're going to get stuck not having a non-kosher bird for this bird to not be, right? Why does it say it needs to be kosher? There has to be something it could have been that isn't kosher. We're going to not have an alternative. And we may also have a lack of alternative for, why does it say it has to be alive? What part of it could have been dead? We may go back to having that problem too. But first we need to learn how Rabbi Yishmael derived, excuse me, that it can't be a treif. So here is the Breita from the school of Rabbi Yishmael. The Tana debe Rabbi Yishmael. Ne'emar machshir u'mechaper bifnim, v'ne'emar machshir u'mechaper bachutz. So there are many, many, many different kinds of animals whose processing is described in the Torah, usually in Sefer Vayikra. And many of them are sacrifices that are offered inside the Beit HaMikdash. Some of them are quasi-sacrifices that are offered outside the Beit HaMikdash. Of the ones that are offered inside the Beit HaMikdash, there are both sacrifices that are machshir, they qualify a person to go back to normal interaction with sacrifices, eating sacrifices, entering the temple, those sorts of things. And many of them are michaper, they atone for sin. Of the animals that are, like I said, quasi-sacrificial, that are outside the temple, some of them are machshir, they allow a person to go back to a normal religious life, and some of them are michaper, they atone. That's all it's said so far. Ma machshir michaper ha'amur bifnim. So that just like the sacrifices that make you fit and the sacrifices that atone inside the temple, asabo machshir k'mechaper, the parameters for what makes a appropriate animal are similar when they're offered inside the Beit HaMikdash. These are both sacrificial animals. They're both going to have to be free of blemishes, and they're going to have similar parameters in terms which species are permitted, that sort of thing. Likewise, af machshir u'mechaper ha'amur bachutz. Likewise, the quasi-sacrifices that make you fit and the quasi-sacrifices that atone that are mentioned outside the Beit HaMikdash, asabo machshir k'mechaper, they also should have similar parameters. Now, in particular, what this means is that we have the seir hamishtalech, right? The scapegoat, the goat that is taken out into the wilderness and pushed off a cliff on Yom Kippur. That goat provides atonement, and it is this sort of quasi-sacrifice killed outside the temple. And we apparently know that it's not allowed to be a treifa. Let's just grant that for the moment. We have just said that an animal that's brought to make somebody fit outside the temple as a quasi-sacrifice, and our bird that's slaughtered for the mitzvah is going to fit that category, has to have all the same parameters as one that's brought outside the temple to atone. So if the seir hamishtalech is not allowed to be a treifa, then the bird that's slaughtered for the mitzvah is also not allowed to be a treifa. So what that means is that we've now said you can't have a treifa as the bird that's brought to be slaughtered for the mitzvah, and now we are back at an impasse. We don't know what kind of non-kosher bird or not alive bird might have been excluded, by the description of the bird that's meant to be, actually both birds that are meant to be brought for the Mitzorah, as Chayot Tehorot. And that is going to have to wait till next week because that's what I have for tonight. And I got the time right this time because it's 8:46. So look at that. And that is where we're going to pick up next week, assuming we're meeting next week, which I don't know, are people around next week? Okay, John says yes. Anybody else have an opinion? All right, well, send me an email if you have a strong feeling. I'm gonna default to having class unless there's a good reason not to. And I will see you then. Are there any questions before we go? Yes, John.
We start with birds and locusts. At least for the Tammany, locusts are also kosher, or at least some birds also kosher. Is there any discussion of similar discussion for locusts?
That is a good question. And I don't know. For our purposes, we really want the word sipor to mean specifically birds and specifically kosher species of birds, because I don't think we want to postulate that there's a mitzvah to send away mother locusts so you can take their eggs. Like I don't think we want to get stuck with such a mitzvah, so I think we would be happier if the word sipor specifically meant kosher birds.
Mhm.
But other than a sort of cultural preference for that to be the end result, I don't know linguistically if there's a similar analysis proving it.
I guess part of the question may be, does the Talmud, which is a little bit different, discuss it differently?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. It's a good question. Okay. Anybody else? All right. So then I will see you all next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.